Welcome, everyone. My name is Aníbal Pérez Liñán. I'm director of the Keough Institute for International Studies. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for this conference celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Tonight, we have the privilege of having with us Ambassador Walton Webson. He has served as the permanent representative to the United Nations in New York of Antigua and Barbuda since 2014. He also served as chair of the Alliance for Small Island States in 2021-22, and he transformed that group into an active member of the United Nations community, advocating and forming policy on this issue. He was director of Perkins International between 2011 and 2014, and he led Perkins International's work in Africa and the Caribbean, starting several programs for children with disabilities in areas where no services had previously existed. Ambassador Webson served as the president of the board of UNICEF in 2017, and he holds a master's in management of nonprofit organizations from the New School for Social Research and a PhD in management from Case Western Reserve University. So we will have the privilege to have his keynote speech today. And after the speech, we will have some comments, and leading the discussion will be our own Ray Offenheiser, who is director of the McKenna Center for Human Development and Global Businesses and senior advisor to the dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. Offenheiser served as the inaugural Pulte director of the Keough School Pulte Institute for Global Development, and he also served for 20 years as the president of Oxfam America. Prior to joining Oxfam, he represented the Ford Foundation in Bangladesh and in the Andean and Southern Corn regions of South America. Ambassador Webson's keynote speech today, Human Rights, a Foundation for Justice and Equality, Fulfilling the Promise of the Sustainable Development Goals, is promising to be a fundamental talk for us in this conference. And please help me giving the ambassador a great welcome.
Thank you very much, and good evening. It is indeed a pleasure, a real honor. I am extremely humbled to be invited to be a keynote speaker at this really very important event at a significant and important time in our global development. I am from a very small island. I've said to my community, the people from the village that I come from, I said to them, every time I speak anywhere in the world, I have to tell people where I am from, and I even challenge people to find it on the map. So I'm from a small island called Antigua. It's a twin island, so it's Antigua and Barbuda. And as you know, some of you may know, in 2017, Barbuda was struck by Hurricane Irma. And it was probably the first island in modern history where the entire island had to be evacuated. Every single person, yes, it wasn't 100,000, it weren't millions, but a few thousand people had to be evacuated off the island because of Hurricane Irma, which was followed within a matter of 2 days by Hurricane Maria. And we were very concerned. So one of the things I will touch on this evening would be the issues of climate and the impact that climate has. And the question to you as an audience would be whether climate justice is justifiable, an argument for us to discuss around the rights for a clean environment. Islands like Antigua and Barbuda and the Caribbean Islands and the Alliance of Small Island States, which is made up of the 39 independent member states of the United Nations. We have been arguing on a number of things that impacts human rights, for more than 30 years. So the issue of climate justice, and we have been raising the flag and define ourselves as the moral authority on the voice of climate since 1992. And we have been arguing for this from Keough right up to this day. And as you know, we have claimed for justice and reparation on this subject. We have claimed for that the polluters should pay, and we have had many promises, but very little delivery over that period of time. These same islands have been arguing for a long time for some economic positions that have put them further back than moving them forward. We have argued that from the 1990s to this day, that we should not be simply judged by GDP or GNI, and that our assessment for international financing and to be part of the international financial community should be based on our vulnerability, an assessment of our social, economic, and environmental vulnerability to be put alongside the questions of GNI. Because many of the countries in the Caribbean in particular, and a few in the Pacific, and one or two in the ACE region, ACE being the South Atlantic, the Asia South Atlantic Africa region. So many of those countries, some of those countries in ACE and in the Pacific, but particularly in the Caribbean, many of those countries are defined as middle income, and even some of us are defined as high income. In fact, the very year Hurricane Irma hit Antigua and Barbuda, Antigua was supposed to be graduated. It's a university, so it's very interesting. It's the only graduation that you don't like to applaud for, you know. We were supposed to be graduated that year in June. Irma hit in September. We lost 24% of our GDP. Palau in the Pacific graduated. COVID-19 hit, and she had to be degraduated. Nobody wants to be graduated and then degraduated. But she had to be degraduated. And therefore, we should have a discussion around the rights for the question of climate finance and development finance, and how that feeds into the rights for social development and environmental rights for a clean environment. Now, the question of, as you know, for social development is linked into the right to development. Right to development, which was grounded in Africa, is a right that links all of the social, cultural, economic development opportunities for countries. So the right for development then links into the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. What is the big promise that we made in 2015? And I had the opportunity in 2015 to be sitting there myself, arguing for certain things within the context of the SDGs. What is the right? What did we argue for? We argued to say, we'll leave no one behind. And I actually take that very seriously, because I believe that we should leave no one behind. And I believe then, therefore, that the right to development is a right that is extended to all people. So while we have the right that is enshrined within the charter, we must look at a few things that move us beyond the charter or should strengthen the charter. Because the charter, since human rights was built on a number of historical facts. Human rights, we know the Magna Carta and all of that. We follow the track on that, and we know that human rights was built on historical facts to quench power. Human rights is the cornerstone of democracy, and we know that this is important as nations move towards democracy and promise equality, inclusion, and access to all. We know that. We know that the linkages, therefore, of these things came for many later. We know that when the Human Rights Charter was developed in the United Nations, there were 56 countries in the United Nations. December 10th, 1948, when the General Assembly voted, there were 56 members. No island state was a member of the United Nations. Today, there are 39 island states in the system, almost a third of the United Nations. But importantly, more than 3 times the number of countries who were not there in 1956 are now here in 2021. And the question that we ask then is, are these things still, all of them, relevant? The answer is probably yes. Are they crossing other impacts from nations that were not there? And there is a clear answer that we have to begin to tease out. Because the cultural impact of the rights that we have put down, we have to step back a little bit and say, who are the ones leading the charge for the rights in 1948? It was those who were victorious from the Second World War. The victors always lays the rules. Those who are defeated have to follow. That's the price of defeat, right? So you follow the rules. You follow what the victors have defined. And therefore, we have to understand that the cultures that we have that were within the body of the United Nations, you have to remember countries that were not there, like island states and so on, colonies and so on, they're not considered, weren't deeply considered to be respected. We formed institutions around the United Nations bodies that were good in 1948, still stand in 2021, 2023, but the cause and has moved ahead. The challenges, the voices have moved ahead. Many of the voices today are still not in the room. The voices that were there in 1948 remained the lead voices in 2023, and many of the voices who are feeling the struggle are still not there. And we have to ask ourselves, is that right, when we're speaking of the rights of people? When we're speaking of the freedom of thought, freedom of action, freedom, when we make all of these claims, the people who are not in the room, are we respecting their rights? I'm sure you have heard prime ministers and leaders from developing countries who have said in international institutions, especially in the IFIs, international finance institutions, that we do not have a voice. The rules are made and it's told to us, and we have to follow it. And I think of that very clearly, because I recall as a young man, very young, I am not a lawyer. I came out of the school of activism. I have been an activist. I call myself a scholar practitioner. I was an activist for persons with disability, and I recall being a strong activist for persons with disability. And I recall being invited to a meeting, just as is done often in many international institutions, even today. And I was invited to this meeting, and I was asked to state my case. I state my case, said, thank you very much, we've heard you now, we will now deliberate, you can go. And I was like, so I do not hear the discussion as to how you're treating my case? We will tell you what the result is tomorrow. But that's the case that happens in many institutions. So over the last couple of years, working with AOSIS, we have attempted to transform that from our perspective, from the island nation's perspective. We have said, we have been meeting with OECD. We have been meeting many times with the banks. We have, of course, had this very strong support of the Secretary General of the United Nations in many of the efforts, and many of our prime ministers and presidents have been very vocal in the cause. I sat in the General Assembly this year, and I said to my prime minister and some others, every single island state who have gone up have said, we need a multi-vulnerability index. We need to change the financial architecture. We need to have a voice. Every single one, and I kid you not. You can go back and listen. Because we believe that the time has come that we have to, in this new global order, that we have to transform and understand that there are populations who are part of this human family whose rights are not being adhered to. Yes, we pay attention to the individual rights that are being trampled on in some societies, and we make a lot of noise. Yes, we pay attention and make a loud voice to issues that affect people from countries who we consider to be the type of countries that we want in our space, and yet we do not listen to nations who are asking for an opportunity where they can have fairer treatment. I want to touch on two other things. Technology. One of the SDG call in I think it's paragraph or it's in the indicator 103. We call for transfer of technology. We know that technology is critical in 2023 for the future in the next generation. In fact, many of us are now calling it the new industrial age, right? Where technology is transforming everything. I myself make the claim that technology is transformative in the lives of persons with disability. Being a person with disability myself, I know that technology has transformed my life. And I say to people, technology for persons with disability is the wheel. What the wheel did in the industrial age in transforming industry, well, technology is doing in transforming the participation, the inclusion of most persons with disability. But technology is great, but we also have to be very careful at the new age and the new advancement in artificial intelligence and the whole area of technology, because we have to be careful about issues of privacy, issues of national development and secrets, if you might, issues of openness and governance. And we have to be careful and make sure that technology is used in a way that is best for the utilization of all citizens and not just some, and that it is accessible to all people, what we call clean technology. And it is also accessible for all people and not a few, and that we can use technology and for the benefit of national development and human development, and not threaten human lives or take over human lives totally. You know, in many smaller and developing societies, while you may be able to get rid of human beings and use robots to do a lot of things, in many developing societies, that can even be disastrous. And we have to think about how we measure that in the growth and progress. Let me, before I enter into what I would like a conversation on the whole issue, let me touch a little bit on climate. Because climate justice is the plea for small island developing states. You would have heard that in recent times, in this year, that nations from many of the island nations in the Caribbean and many of the island nations in the Pacific have said, enough is enough. We need to begin to think a little broader, and we need to do something more about gaining our rights. And we need, rather than only appealing at the UNFCCC meetings, and getting many promises but little delivery, we need to take the next step. You know that in 2009, a promise was made for $100 billion to assist countries from climate disaster. We know that up to 2020, that very little was given. We know small island states received less support in 2020 than they received in 2015. We know that after COVID-19, small island states and many developing countries had to, in order to go to the bank because many countries lost a lot of their economy. Many countries are mono industry. They depend on tourism, especially island nations. And we lost a lot. Some lost, Antigua and Barbuda lost 18% of its GDP. Some lost 20, some lost more. And we know that to borrow money, small island states were borrowing at higher rates than international and developed countries. Many developed countries were borrowing at 2 and 3%. Small island states had to go to the commercial bank and borrow 7 and 10%. That didn't make any sense to most people, that a very rich country could borrow. But economically, with the credit ratings and all of that, it made sense to the economy. And I know I'm in a university and many people here. As I said at the beginning, I'm only a diplomat. I am not a lawyer and I'm not your economist. I can tell you that for us, working with the international community, we clearly didn't think, and you would have heard many prime ministers speak out about transformation of the banks, transformation of the institutions that would allow for better financing. So two main things occurred, and we can talk more about them. One is called the Bridge Loan Initiative, which was championed by Prime Minister Motley of Barbados and got very good support from Macron of France. And we were able to take that argument to the international community, the Secretary General and who's been an extremely good supporter of the call for small island states to be given fairer treatment. We took that forward. And then we also, as AOSIS leadership, we took to the Secretary General and he placed a technical committee to develop what we call a multi-vulnerability index, MVI. And that index we saw as a tool to work with the international financial institutions in assessing the needs of small island developing states for development, and that we are not only going to use, we propose, the GNI assessment, but that the MVI assessment or multi-vulnerability index assessment is also used as a major tool in assessing the progress and assessing the needs of small islands. Because when you are battered by a hurricane and you come out of it, as you know, in small islands, you can't, if you get hit here by a snowstorm and you get fed up, you can move to Chicago or you can move to Florida. In a small island, you move to one side of the island, it's just as much battered. 3 weeks ago, my own village was hit by a lightning storm from a major flood, and it lost over, a lot of the businesses were burned down. It meant that that more than 100 and something people, which mightn't sound like a lot to you, but to a smaller island with a population of 100,000, with a working population of just over 50,000, just over 60,000, and in a community that it's one of its main breadbasket, to lose over 100 jobs is a lot of people. And also means that 100 is amplified by the families that are hurt because these businesses were lost. And we're saying that the assessment for international finance, whether it's grants or it's loans for small island states, must be fairer, and that the MVI working with the GNI can be a much fairer tool of assessment. The right to development, therefore, one of the cornerstone, in my opinion, of development rights and human rights, which was called for through the G77 and the African organization, G77 being one of the groups of the United Nations, made up of, although it says G77, it's G77 and China. Although it says G77 and China, it's more than 130 members. And we, as a group, have been since the 1960s. And as you know, the right to development was passed in the United Nations in 1986. And this right to development, as I said earlier, links to the SDGs and the MDGs and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and links to that in order to assure the rights of people at all levels of society, a right to an education, a right to health and well-being, right to equal opportunity and decent work, right to equity, a right to provide work, decent work, and then of course gender parity, right, for gender parity. So these are direct human relations, human impact, and yes, the right to freedom, yes, the right to equal, to avoid inhumane treatment, yes to all of the rights in the Charter, because the Charter is deeply enshrined. We as small states have only one thing we can hold on to. That's the United Nations. Because in the United Nations, it's a true democracy. In the United Nations, whether you have 2 billion people or you have 100,000 people like my nation, you have one vote. And that one vote, therefore, is the vote that we all call for. If we lose that impact, if we lose the right in the United Nations and its machinery, therefore we lose as small island and developing states. We lose the opportunity to be part of the global community. And that's what we are calling for in other global institutions, not just the General Assembly, where that right is most exercised. So I want to thank you for an opportunity to speak to you. I look forward to a conversation to expand these thoughts so we can build on it, and that you and us can work together. I would like to see small island states be given much more of a prominence in terms of greater studies. I've spoken and said that in my own university, alma mater in the Caribbean, and I've said that in universities. And I think the situation of small island developing states, which is growing, and our impact in the United Nations, today our voice is a much stronger and more cohesive voice than it ever was. In 2024, next year, we will be having our 4th, what we call SIDS conference. Every 10 years, the small island developing states have a conference to chart its agenda for the next 10 years. It started in 1994 in Barbuda. Then we went to Mauritius in 2004. Then we went to Samoa. And we have the Samoa pathway, which we're ending this year. And in 2024, the SIDS conference will be held in Antigua and Barbuda, at which time we will be charting a new course. And we believe that we'll be charting a more ambitious course under the theme of resilient prosperity, charting the future with resilient prosperity, because we believe that small island states, we are resilient people, and in order for us to move forward, to be prosperous, we must continue to show our resilience, because we will continue our geographical position we can't change. We will always be hit by climate zone. What we can change, the globe can change, is the rate. Many of you, I am sure, in your own societies here, have seen the difference between the difference in climate change over the last 25 years in your own country. In my own island, people speak about the intense heat when it was not that way 25 years ago. People speak about the intense storms when it was not that way. We now have Category 5 hurricane. The first Category 5 hurricane was declared when? 2017. That's only, 6 years ago? And it shows that how much we have seen an increase in the whole, in climate change over the last 20 years. I always tell people, I was born in Antigua, I grew up in Trinidad, and I had not seen a hurricane until 1980-something, 87. And the hurricanes, yes, hit the Caribbean from time to time, hit all of the islands from time to time, but it so happened that only in recent times, I don't think any child born in 1990 to now can say that he or she, if they lived in the Caribbean, they lived in Trinidad or Antigua as I did, can say that they have not seen a hurricane. It's not going to happen because you see the hurricanes now more frequently, and they are hitting the islands more ferociously. Every year we expect some island to be hit by some hurricane. And if Florida is hit, you can move to New York. If Antigua is hit, it's not as easy. Although we move in the Caribbean, we do have movement of people. We do move from one place to the next in order to protect each other because we are a family. But our claim is the countries that create the pollution that has brought us this upon us ought to pay for it. As you know, I would indicate in closing, as you know that this year, some countries have taken to the International Court of Justice to ask for an opinion on whether or not countries, the consensus opinion, whether or not countries should be made to pay. And they have asked for an opinion on three aspects of the case, and the ICJ is looking at that case will be presented to ICJ early next year. The case that brought by Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu and others that went to ITLOS is now before ITLOS, and we will see what happens there. As you know, there's also a case in the courts of the Americas, the Human Rights Courts of the Americas, on the whole climate issue, which is brought by Colombia and others in the Caribbean. And I gather there's also a case in the European Court of Human Rights brought by the young people of Portugal. So you know that the world is marching on in an attempt to bring about change and a fairer change in the rights for development of all its people. And I want to leave you with that and to open a conversation with Ray on the subject. I thank you very much.
Thank you. He very much welcomed a lively conversation. So if you haven't thought of a question yet, please consider what you might like to ask in a moment. And when we do open it up, I think we have microphones in the room, and this is being recorded, so we're very much likely to have a mic in hand if you do have a question. So first of all, Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us, and we really appreciate you coming to this event honoring the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. Here at the Keough School, here at Notre Dame, human rights is something we care deeply about, and we celebrate, I think tonight, this particularly important and auspicious anniversary. And I think maybe one of the things to underline, and I think your presence, I think, speaks to this. I think we did want to underline in the way this conference is being organized the fact that there were 56 nations at the UN when the Declaration of Human Rights was created, but there are 193 nations today that actually constitute the United Nations. And so it's worthy of having a conversation that includes, as you rightly pointed out, all of those nations that perhaps don't get the center stage and the media attention that the industrialized countries get. So we very much welcome having your voice with us today. I thought I might begin with maybe picking up on the whole issue of the right to development, because I think the general public, it's not a debate that the general public actually generally hears in the mainstream media. And I thought it might be useful for you to just give us a little bit of the kind of maybe the evolution and how this emerged within the United Nations. I think you pointed out that actually it was African nations that originated it in the 1980s, and then eventually the United Nations endorsed it. But I would hasten to point out that most of the industrialized nations, including the United States, voted against it. So they were not happy with the idea. So it actually has been a contested concept, even though it has gotten approval ultimately at the United Nations. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how it evolved and what is kind of added to the conversation. And I think it might maybe add one characterization. I think to some degree it came about at a time when we were still struggling with the fact that to many of the Western countries, the human rights that we were actually in support of were more about civil and political rights, but not about economic, social, and cultural rights. And in some ways, the African nations were making that point, I think, powerfully with their push for the right to development. Maybe you can correct me or amplify it on that particular aspect of its history.
Thank you very much, Ray. And yes, indeed, as I said, when the declaration and the charter was, when the charter was declared in 1940s, and there were 56 member nations voting, many of the countries in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia, were not thought of as countries. There were very few Asian countries born as member states. And at that time, the rights that the industrialized or Western countries would have thought of were embodied in the rights in the rights of individuals, in their cultural rights and so on. The African countries and the developing countries in the 80s began to force that to look at social development. And that led to a whole storm of changes. Because by then the numbers were there, whether the industrialized countries voted no or yeah, the numbers were there to now change some of that dynamics. So in 1986, in the General Assembly, that came forward. G77 and China led that call for the right to the development. It is being discussed as we speak, because even today, it's still not considered by many Western countries. However, many of those same countries have voted in support of the SDGs. The MDGs became, which is the forerunner to the SDGs, 2020 to 2015, the MDGs began to build on the right to development. And then the SDGs has further amplified that call. So I believe that we are at a point where there is a lot more consideration, and even developed nations are beginning to understand that development cannot mean the right to development must mean a right to economic development, a right to social development, and now, even more so, the right for a clean environment that can lead to countries having an opportunity to develop.
So, Ambassador, is it fair to say that in addition to kind of opening up space and opportunity for voice for a whole variety of nations who weren't present at the formation of the Declaration, that the right to development actually created space for a variety of different kinds of groups to be heard, and that a variety of other kinds of declarations were actually, a follow-on to the right to development for different kind of marginalized groups? And you might, I'm sure you probably have some examples of those kinds of groups that now have recognition in the UN.
Indeed. And as you know, the first Human Rights Act or Civil Rights Movement declaration in the 21st century to be passed in the United Nations was the rights of persons with disability. The right of persons with disability is built on the whole civil rights, in some ways built on the civil rights movements from the United States, and it built on the right for the individual's right for development. And that, therefore, has led to a major transformation in the engagement and the acceptance in many societies, of persons with disabilities. That was one of the legislations, if you might, in the United Nations, one of the treaties that was passed quickest and received and was put into force quickest. We also have seen a lot more movement because of the right to development in the understanding of issues around, as I said earlier, environment and climate. So I believe the right to development, even though it had, at the moment when it was passed, did not receive the kind of support that we all would have wanted, I believe, 30 years later, almost 30 years later, and as we discussed that this year at the United Nations, in this new session, I believe that the right to development is being seen as essential in the treaties of human rights for all individuals, if we are to leave no one behind.
And I think also contested, perhaps during the debates about the right to development, also the rights for women, the CEDAW provisions, yes, and rights for indigenous peoples, and yes, rights for peasants, I think, were yes, all ones that actually ultimately were, I think, brought through the system.
Yes, and those came a little before the rights of persons with disabilities. And obviously they all built on the initiative that was started on the whole rights to development. And the question of CEDAW, which is the rights on women, and the committee that deals with that, and indigenous people. Yes, indeed. These are all strong claims and pushed particularly by countries, developing countries, where those persons, indigenous people, are most disadvantaged.
And perhaps maybe the other sort of element that I think the right to development has given us is also the recognition of collective rights as opposed to individual rights, which I think, in some sense, I think embodied by particularly in the case of indigenous peoples. The other piece I think that you spoke to, I think a minute ago, is the emergence of the concept of climate justice. And could you help us understand a little bit more precisely how that kind of evolved out of the right to development, and sort of how has that added value to the discourse? Because it's now you're hearing it, from leading spokespersons in the climate movement as a way of speaking about the way that climate, in some sense, has inequitable kinds of outcomes in different localities and different geographies. I think, as you're rightly pointing out in the case of island states.
Okay. Climate justice for small islands in particular. The question on climate change is existential. Many islands will not exist if we continue at the rate that we are at this moment. We'll pass the 1.5, which was created by that whole concept was given life by the small islands. And we are heading, and in some scientific assessment, we are already there at the 1.5. There are islands in the Pacific that are already contemplating their future state within another state, because at this rate, those islands will be no more, but the people will be, and they will have to live on another country to unclaim their island. That's a live discussion. The countries that have made provisions for that. Now, that's not correct. That's not meeting the challenge to leave no one behind. With the question of climate justice is further raised because the appeal has been made for many years. We tried, as you know, from Keough to the discussions in Brazil and Denmark. We have had 27, we're about to have the 28th Conference of State Parties, COP, to address the questions. COP has grown to a huge thing, but we continue to receive promises, and we continue to fail the responses from islands. So we have decided as island states to move the discussion from simply on the table to move it into the courts and begin to claim the issue of climate justice. Because we believe that you will have climate refugees. I just spoke to the issue of countries moving, and you therefore need to begin to find ways of how can those who pollute the most help to pay to help those countries who are suffering more. In war, we so often speak of reparation, and we have forced countries to pay reparation. The climate war is real, and there ought to be some sort of reparatory justice. And in this instance, the islands are calling for it and asking the courts for an opinion on this claim.
Maybe a follow-on for that, maybe to pick up on your remarks again, is this development finance challenge. I think I was in Washington at the time working with a lot of the environmental groups when we actually persuaded the administration at the time to commit to the $100 million per year it was 100 billion.
100 billion.
100 billion a year. Commitment to climate finance. And of course, we've not seen any significant contribution to that, other than it was a great PR success, I think, at the time for many of the industrialized nations. But in terms of delivering real dollars, not quite significant. But we've lost a lot of time. And so when you're looking at this with colleagues now and you're thinking about, what do we need to do in development finance? What are the vehicles we need? What institutions need to be involved? What's the role of business, for example? How has the picture changed, and have we changed the proposition about what we need to be doing in terms of like one fund that's going to do it all? Do we need to have multiple channels and multiple institutions involved to kind of?
The call for 100 billion was 2009 in Denmark, if you remember.
Right.
And so here we are, 15 years almost later, and very little of that 100 billion have been dispersed. The call now is that it's not 100 billion, it's into trillions at this time. What we did in leading AOSIS in 2021 was to raise two things that did not get raised in 2015 at Paris, and to decide and to declare that these two things are critical in transforming the discourse on climate finance. One, we identified the fossil fuel industry, which was not named in 2015. If you read the Paris Agreement, nowhere did it ever say fossil fuel is a major cause. We were able to get that on the table. And for us, most importantly, we were able to get on the table a discussion which resulted in a transitional committee on loss and damage. Loss and damage because it's not, and we do not just simply mean insurance. We are talking real issues to look at it, and some of it is historical, and some of it is in the present. There are discussions around different institutions. I just read this afternoon, one of my colleagues sent out a note in the many WhatsApp group that you're involved in, that sent out a note saying to me, Ambassador, look, the World Bank is now, they said on Saturday there was some discussion around the World Bank on moving ahead, even though many industrialized and developed countries and G20 countries are not moving as fast. But if that's true, and I don't know that, if that's true, and as I said, I only saw that this afternoon, so I have to look into it. But if that's true, kudos to the bank, because we need to find different sources. We already have the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to be the institution that is responding, and the GIF. We now need, if the World Bank is one of those groups dealing with the loss and damage, and there are other ideas that are floating around, some of which I won't be able to say right now, but there are other ideas that are being floated in terms of how this loss and damage fund should be created and how it should be managed and we believe that loss and damage in the COP28, which is the one that starts in 2-3 weeks, almost we are at a tipping point, and in this whole climate challenge and the discussion on climate justice. And if the loss and damage fund can be truly established and can be made functional without the usual bureaucratic delays, we then have an opportunity, and some of us may have hope and can begin to dare to hope. Because if we do not address some of these questions, then unfortunately there is no hope. Thanks. Okay.
So maybe just a couple of quick comments. One of them is, for our audience members, the United States has been one of the major obstacles to kind of advancing the discussion on loss and damage, consistently from one COP to the next. I think that's one interesting little fact worth knowing. The other is, maybe something to consider is that, when the debt relief issue was really a big challenge at the turn of the millennium, one of the proposals was for the IMF to liquidate some of its reserve accounts to actually save African nations from the debt problem. And one of the interesting questions is whether that might be an issue that we should revive. I'm saying that to you as in your activist capacity. Hoping that you might pick up on that. And so maybe just as a final comment, and I know you've worked a lot on the SDGs, and the UN just released its 2023 report on the SDGs and how we're doing. And it basically, I think the opening line in that is we're sounding an alarm that we're not achieving the goals, and the international community is failing on its commitments to the SDGs. I wonder if you want to maybe just comment on that a little bit, because in some ways it aligns with the larger discussion on climate.
No, you are absolutely correct. The sad position is, and I know very often we use COVID-19, because COVID-19 did put many, especially developing countries, further back. Our financial situation became very difficult, and the globe is not on track to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And we have to more than double our effort now in order to address the questions of how we achieve the objectives that we set out to achieve, to leave no one behind. All the hope we had in 2015 and the excitement of hope has faded, and we are at this moment having very, very challenging discussions around the issues of hope and the issues of these SDGs. We have to get back on track, because it is within the context of development and the right to development. The SDGs is our best hope, or our last hope, I might dare say. In fact, we like to say in the small islands that this decade, 24 through 34, is the last decade of hope for many of the small islands. And if we do not transform and to meet the SDGs, if we are not helped both financially, technologically, and socially, and most importantly, address the environmental challenge, it is indeed our last hope. So the SDGs stands as a beacon of possibility, but it is only possible if the other strands, environment, social and environmental challenges, and the economic challenge, which is to meet the debt crisis. You made mention, Ray, of the debt crisis for African nations at the turn of the century. We have raised that. We have raised the possibility of the international community looking at a debt relief program for small island developing states and for many developing countries. At the moment, it's not there. There are some new methods that the bank and the IMF has come up with, and some of it have been taken up by some countries, but not even as enough as they would have wanted. And some of it is still loans. So we still have a crisis. We are coming up with innovative ways to challenge how we address that. My Prime Minister has offered a number of interesting ways. The Prime Minister of Barbuda has offered a number of interesting ways. And we are hoping that together with things like the MVI and the Bridgestone Initiative, we can create opportunities. We have asked as small islands about a window within the financial institutions, specifically for small islands. We have asked for opportunities in terms of moratorium. There are opportunities that are being organized or being discussed around other creative forms of loans, such as debt for climate swap and um, as a method of addressing these. But I don't think we have yet hit the sweet spot when we can all feel that this is a new opportunity that we can challenge, that can make waves. We're looking towards 2024 as small islands and the 2024 Resilience to Prosperity Conference, and hoping that in Antigua, Barbuda, we can come up with an agenda that can help to chart the way for small island developing states that can fulfill the SDGs and march forward towards a way forward towards a resilient, prosperous communities.
So maybe I would just, maybe as a comment, I want to just mention a moment our excitement at the voice and the powerful voice that Mia Mottley, as Prime Minister, has brought to the COPs in Glasgow and then again in Egypt, and the initiative she's taken. So it's really put I think, created a new powerful voice in this discussion. And really, I think a lot of credit goes to the Alliance of Small Island States. So I hope you convey her thanks and our excitement with the role she's playing in the talks. I'd like to open it up now for questions. If anybody has a question, and please grab a mic. Maybe we'll start over here and then we'll pop to the other side of the room.
Sure, no problem.
Please identify yourself as well. Just say who you are and where you're from.
No problem. Hi, great evening, everyone. My name is Bernice Eintwine. I major in business analytics and global affairs, and I'm from the beautiful country of Trinidad and Tobago. So glad to have a Caribbean participant here. Welcome, Ambassador. Oh, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm especially appreciative of this audience with you here tonight. So my question is centered around the need for us as Caribbean nationals to center ourselves on the global stage. I noticed a sentiment that has been generated over and over, particularly right before I left the island. I participated in an IDP conference, and that sentiment was brought up again. So as being a part of the diaspora community, me particularly as a student at Notre Dame, at an American university, what do you see as my role and responsibility for ensuring that the Caribbean continues to be centered in these pivotal conversations, especially as we disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change?
I'm not sure I got the.
She was interested in knowing, what role as a student in an American university she would play as a Caribbean citizen in voicing these kinds of critiques.
Well, as you know, a lot of the voices to change not just this society, not just 2023, a lot of change is brought about by young people, youth. The case that Vanuatu is bringing before the ICJ, supported by a number of countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific, is being brought forward to the ICJ because the youth of Vanuatu said to their government, we need you to take this to court and take this to the International Court of Justice, or we might take you to the Court of Justice. And Vanuatu's government took their youth seriously. The court, I made reference, I think, to the case by the young people of Portugal. And of course, we know Ms. Thunberg from Sweden. So what I'm saying is, as a young person, as a student in the United States, we want to hear Caribbean students and youth, all youths, really advocating in their universities and in the states and in the country, bringing a voice. What we have not heard in industrial societies like the United States is enough young voices calling for change. Yes, we have heard certain leaders. Yes, we have heard certainly out of the United Nations and so on. But we haven't heard the voice of young people at their university, asking their university, demanding their university, demanding their state, demanding the country to do things for climate change and to transform it. That's what you can do. here, and of course, help us back in the Caribbean. We have a youth conference around the SIDS meeting next year, and we need youths to be making a clear declaration to our Caribbean and SIDS government, as well as to the international community, because all United Nations conferences are for all the members. Even though it's a SIDS conference, all 193 will be there because it's Antigua, right? Beautiful place. So they all want to go, right? So we want youth voices, and your voice, my sister, is a voice that can be part of that champion.
I think we have one other question over here.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, for that great overview and putting the challenges so succinctly. So throughout, you mentioned two things, international institutions and reparations. With regard to international institutions, which ones do you think you'll be able to leverage the best? And you mentioned the General Assembly. Do you recommend that in terms of the international institution like the UN, that change is needed there, or would the General Assembly be able to do the work for you? Because most of your kind of resolutions and issues that you talked about stems from there. And with regard to reparations, have there been any conversation about how reparations, when given to island nations, how it will impact governance, and how are island nations thinking of fortifying themselves with the use of technology against the growing climate threats? Because you also talked about technology. So it's several questions in that two-part component of institutions and reparations. Thank you.
Indeed, I was just thinking there's a lot of questions. Let's see if we could take the first part of the first question around the United Nations and around the institutions. I'm not sure, the way we're structured now, we can't just pick out one institution. If we're speaking about the issue of finance, we are speaking, for instance, in the discussion on the MVI, Multi-Vulnerability Index, as a tool that is necessary in financial transformation. It was important and is important that be started at the United Nations, and the discussion received the backing of the members of the United Nations, but its implementation has to be within a financial institution. And that's either the World Bank or the IMF. So there isn't any one institution. We need institutional reform, but we need all the institutions to be alive and to begin to practice the things. The new head of the World Bank is very open and is speaking the right things. We need now, and I even heard Prime Minister Motley complimenting him, and she using the metaphor of cricket by saying he was hitting sixes. And my Trinidadian friend would know that sixes means you have hit a home run. Okay, that's the comparison. So we need all the institutions to work together. In terms of the reparation question, the question of reparation is critical to governance, and it's critical for the importance in development. Climate reparation is one thing. We are also in the Caribbean speaking more broadly of reparation on a different subject, with the reparation coming out of the genocide of slavery. And that is a major conversation in the Caribbean, and it has gained significant traction from the head of the University of the West Indies, who is the head of the CARICOM Reparation Committee, and it is now beginning to gain traction in the parliaments in the United Kingdom and so on. We believe that there got to be some discussion around governance as that relates, and that as this discussion becomes more, as this discussion begins to take more hold, we have to begin to plan, working with the universities and the CARICOM and other Caribbean nations, begin to address this question more holistically. And there's a very interesting plan that was laid out by the Reparation Committee, headed by Dr. Sir Hilary Beckles, that kind of shows how this might happen. And I think the question of whether it's climate reparation or reparation in the broad context of a response to the genocide of slavery and colonialism, has to be taken very seriously and be addressed. The discussion in the United Nations Hall has not taken hold on the discussion on the matter of reparation of genocide from a Caribbean context. I have to say, I read and I was asked to discuss as AOS's chair on the question of reparation from another more recent war, which I won't go into. But I said to my colleagues, oh, just imagine. Anyway, and this matter is very important to us and very serious, and we intend to address the question of reparation more firmly. You're already, many of our prime ministers are beginning to speak to it more publicly, and many prime ministers this past General Assembly made it in their national statements. So we know that it is now something that we feel we should be addressing as a region. So I think that's the General Assembly remains the best body at this that we have to provide the kind of support. The United Nations, as you know, there has several bodies. The one that is most powerful in some ways, but does not deliver quickly or certainly effectively enough, is the Security Council. And there's a lot of discussion about, and has been, and continues to be, about the reform of the Security Council. And last December, the General Assembly took some initiative to decide to speak out and vote on issues that the Security Council cannot vote on because of the veto. Because as you know, the veto in the Security Council often stymies progress because one power feels that another power should not be able to take control over X or Y. And we feel at times that in principle, that ought to change. And we have been making a lot more emphasis on what the General Assembly can address and can share to the global community.
So do you want to take one more question? We'll take one more question.
Thank you for delivering such an inspiring talk and so eloquently. My question is a value-based question because we've gathered to talk about dignity. At the bottom of whatever has been said today is the question of greed and consumption and how certain nations or those in power are able to operate in a way that marginalizes others. It could be people, it could be countries. So while a lot of discussion can happen based on the law and this is what is right and this is what is wrong, how do you have that conversation based on the value? And I say this particularly because in your talk, you've referred to, the islanders being family. We take care of family. We move from one place to other, which seems very different from an individualistic consumption-based model, which has led to this problem. So your thoughts on this?
I think Ray, in his comments, or it might have been in some notes I read, made reference to that we were moving from corporate. It's the form of democracy that we have, what drives us. And it seems like, we have moved, we were driven for a while, primarily by the corporations or the shareholders of corporations. I think we might be moving back, recognizing the challenges that we're facing as a global community and recognizing the interrelation between communities. What the internet and technology has done is brought the global community closer together. So we now know the pain, even if we don't always seem to feel it, we know the pain that each other is facing anywhere in the world within minutes that you face it. So technology has said to us that we know that there's where people are suffering and starving and so on. And we now can empathize and we can now begin to share. So we're moving to a time, a place where there is a little bit more emphasis on sharing and giving when there's less emphasis. And it doesn't always seem that way. But if you look at philanthropy, you would see that a lot of the foundations are now looking to provide support in a different way from how we did it. We did development support to make us feel good, I think. Ray, I think you said you were involved with Oxfam. So you would know that philanthropy in the 1990s, it didn't quite, the development model didn't quite work. But now we're seeing a lot more change where people are beginning to reach out, and all over the world, organizations, foundations are being born to provide better assistance to the individual. Now, whether it is providing assistance that allowed people to develop and get on their feet in the way we would like to see, we don't know. But what I do know is the SDGs has given us some hope. And if we can work towards the fulfillment of the SDGs, your question of empathy and your question of family can be addressed in the mix of the development milieu that we all live in.
So maybe as a closing reflection, I just want to offer, in light of the ambassador's really inspiring remarks, just a reflection on the sort of 2015 when the SDGs were actually approved at the United Nations. Just two little vignettes. One is there was, a march in New York that weekend, and it was 4 hours long, and literally hundreds of thousands of people, mostly young people, came from all over the United States and marched in that march, basically to make the point to the United Nations leadership that this was critical, that passing the SDGs was critical, but also if you actually attended the march as I did, you actually saw that the critical theme that was really present in almost with all the groups marching, and these were all citizen groups, was the climate issue. And this was, I think, really important and an important reminder to the UN delegates of their responsibility and heads of state who are at the UN of their responsibility for passing the SDGs and being serious about climate. And the thing that I think is important to recognize, particularly for, I think, the young people in our audience, is this is still a fight. And there's active resistance to a lot of the propositions that are part of the climate agenda that the ambassador has been speaking to. And so, and at that same United Nations meeting at the SDGs, the night before one of the final approvals of the SDG documents, there were delegations from certain countries that were actually trying to remove the climate goal from the SDGs entirely. And there was literally a kind of a riotous meeting, basically, where there was pushback on that particular point. So I think you have to realize that this fight is not over, and it's still, there's quite a few rounds left. And it's going to require quite a bit of activism and quite a bit of voice, particularly from your generation as well as mine, I think, really to get this across the finish line and get the kind of results I think that the ambassador has actually represented. So I think as a number of people have actually remarked in the media, and this is an existential crisis. It's not a normal crisis. It's not one that's going to be easily resolved. This is a crisis for the planet and crisis for human beings as a species, and one I think we have to sort of gird ourselves to take on. So, Ambassador, I want to thank you for an extraordinarily inspirational talk. I think it's really, I think, inspiring for us to know that there are individuals like yourself walking the halls at the UN and reminding folks that this is an issue that we've really got to take seriously. And I really want to compliment the Alliance of Small Island States for all the work and leadership that you've been providing over literally the last 30 years or so at the UN on this particular issue, and particularly more recently, Prime Minister Motley's particularly powerful presence at these meetings. So thank you all for coming. I hope you found this an informative evening, and we have a reception next door with some, I think, some hors d'oeuvres that may be getting cold now because we're a few minutes over. Heavy hors d'oeuvres, heavy hors d'oeuvres. You can have your dinner over there. So we'll adjourn right now. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.